name is David Adams, and I teach Old Testament at Concordia Seminary. I'm honored to be able to be here with you today for this, and that is how the Gospel is presented in the Old Testament, and especially using the book of Exodus as kind of an example of that. The year that you graduated, Chris, I started doing archaeology on behalf of the seminary. So I spent most of my summers in the Middle East, in Syria, and Jordan, Egypt, and for the last few years in Israel doing archaeological work. There, for the last few years, until this last summer, was part of the senior excavation staff at a place called Kirbet Keafa, which nobody here has ever heard of, probably. It's a little spot in the road on a hilltop in Judah. But it happens to be the most important archaeological site in the Holy Land right now. Because, among other things, we found the oldest Hebrew inscription ever found there in 2008. And also, it turns out that this site is really very important for understanding the history of the period. It was a military base, not really a town. It was a purpose-built military facility. And it was, while it's not mentioned by name in the Bible, it was the place where Saul's headquarters was for the 40 days of fighting that led up to the battle between David and Goliath. So it sits on the hilltop up on the ridge overlooking the valley, and you can still see the stream running through the valley where David picked up the stones, and so the fight between David and Goliath happened right beneath us there. And the reason the site's important is not so much because of its association with David and Goliath, but because it is forcing scholars to reassess the history of Israel in the period of the rise of the monarchy, about 1000 BC. Period of Saul and David. Ironically, and not surprisingly from my perspective, it's forcing them to revise their views in a way that is more conservative. That is, the point is that this side is actually helping to show that the things that the Bible said happened actually happened. But for now, we want to look, as I said, at the way the Old Testament communicates the gospel. And we're going to use the book of Exodus as kind of a test case for seeing how the Old Testament communicates the gospel. I'd like to begin with a couple of introductory general observations. And the first might be a question. Is there any gospel in the Old Testament? I ask this question because many people, particularly many Lutheran people, have the idea that there's not much gospel in the Old Testament. Part of this comes from our clear and very important distinction between law and gospel. We know, we characterize this distinction in a variety of ways. We say the law shows our sin and the gospel shows our Savior. That's certainly true. We say the law commands and the gospel promises, which is also true. We think of the law as the Old Testament and the gospel as the New Testament. But that is not true. There is gospel in the New Testament, certainly, God's promises, but there's also gospel in the Old Testament, as we'll be talking about today. And there's law in the New Testament. As an Old Testament professor, I sometimes have quipped that I hardly ever preach on the New Testament because there's so little gospel in the New Testament. Almost all of Paul's letters, when you think about it, almost all of Paul's letters are basically law. The vast majority of them are law. There's only a little bit of gospel there. Most of Jesus' teaching was actually law. Which leads us to the next distinction that we sometimes make, that the law is bad and the gospel is good. And that's also not true. For example, St. Paul said, "What shall we say? That the law is sin?" And he answers the question by saying, "By no means," in Romans 7. The law is holy. The commandment is holy and righteous and good. So Paul, speaking by the Holy Spirit, certainly didn't take the view that the law was bad and the gospel is good. Jesus himself said, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus also understood that it's not the case that the law is bad and the gospel is good. So what is the law then? Well, one of the ways that we sometimes characterize the law is in terms of what it does. We sometimes talk about the three uses of the law. I never quite like that terminology because that implies that that's the way we use the law. It's not the way we use the law, it's the way God uses the law. And the fact is that God uses the law, and we hear it. So the law curbs evil. For example, God has placed in each of us, and as He created us, a conscience, and built certain things into our conscience, from childhood. So we know that it's just wrong to hurt someone, to injure someone else, or to kill, or to steal, or other things like that. Our conscience tells us that, even if we've never read the Bible. In this sense, God has built the law into the way we exist and operate as people. The law, by building that consciousness into us, God has used the law to curb evil among mankind generally. The law reveals our need for God's grace, and this is one of the reasons we tend to think of the law as bad, because it shows us our own shortcoming and our own need. And the fact that we cannot, by our own strength, satisfy the demands of a perfect God. And finally, the law also teaches us how to be the people of God. Once we know that we have become the people of God by God's grace through His becoming man in Jesus Christ and suffering and dying and being raised from the dead, we want to know how we should live as the people of God. And the law helps to teach us how we should live as the people of God. The gospel is a little more straightforward. The gospel tells us of God's gracious saving work. What has God done in order to restore the relationship between us and God that is broken by our sinfulness and unfaithfulness? That's the message of the gospel. And some of the things that God did, He did before the coming of Christ, to point the way to what He was going to do in Christ. And so in that sense, some of God's gracious saving work takes place in the Old Testament. That's going to be part of what we'll look at today. So is there any gospel in the Old Testament? Emphatically, yes, there is. Although, because it's gospel that's presented before the coming of Jesus, it anticipates, foreshadows, prophesies, if you will, proclaims, and is finally fulfilled, is filled out in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The second, maybe related question is, how is the gospel communicated in the Old Testament? How is it told to us? This is a little more complicated question in the Old Testament than it is in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have the story of Jesus' life and death in the Gospels. And then we have the letters that Paul and others of the apostles wrote to the churches to guide them, to teach them about what Christ had done and to guide them in their walk in Christ. The Old Testament is different, however, in this respect. When we talk about the Old Testament, we sometimes divide it up in terms of blocks of literature. So we talk about the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and we talk about the historical books, and the prophets. We tend to think of it in terms of literary blocks. And that's perfectly legitimate to do, but there's another way that I might approach the Old Testament, and you might too, and that's in terms of how it communicates what it says about God. How does it articulate the message that it has? And there are really 2 different ways in the Old Testament. I call them here theological traditions. That might be not the right wording. 2 approaches. I'd like to say something like 2 approaches to communicating the gospel, but that won't fit on the slide very well. So you have to find some short way to articulate that. And these 2 we might call the prophetic tradition and the wisdom tradition. Now, we'll say just a little bit about each of these. Begin with the wisdom tradition, because the one we're going to talk most about is the prophetic tradition. So I want to get the wisdom tradition out of the way a little bit. When we talk about the wisdom tradition, we don't mean certain books, which we call wisdom literature, but really a theological perspective, a way of talking about what God has done. The wisdom tradition reveals God from the perspective of how God is at work in, with, and under the order of creation. The Old Testament and New Testament too works with this idea that as God created the world, He created it He didn't create it as as utter chaos, but rather He built an order and a way of working into the world that we might call the order of creation. And the way that God put the world together and made it work tells us something about God. It doesn't tell us everything about God, but it does tell us some important things about God. So the wisdom tradition tends to look at the way the world works and the way the world is, and learns from it something about God, its creator. So just to give you a quick example, because we're not going to talk a lot about the wisdom tradition, we might look at a psalm that reflects this wisdom tradition, like Psalm 19. Here we'll just look at the beginning of it. The heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims its handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there any words whose voice is not heard. So the psalmist is here looking at creation and saying, creation speaks to us. It speaks to us about God who created it. And even though creation has been despoiled as a result of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, nevertheless, it can't, and as a result, it can't tell us everything about God. It can tell us some things still. And the wisdom tradition is embodied in some psalms like this one, certain books like Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, a number of the Psalms, and so forth. And there are wisdom perspectives that show up also in some of the prophetic books and some of the historical books. But the other tradition, we might call the prophetic tradition, if the wisdom tradition reveals God from the perspective of the order of creation, the prophetic tradition reveals God from the perspective of how God is at work in, with, and under the events of history, particularly Israel's history, although not only Israel's history. So the prophetic tradition is reflected in a number of types of literature in the Old Testament. We think particularly of the latter prophets, those classic prophets who's given the names to books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and when in Old Testament speak we call the 12, meaning the minor prophets, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, those guys, little books that no one can remember exactly where they are. But all of the latter prophets are concerned with interpreting what God is doing and their time and place in the events of history that's unfolding there. Also, we have a collection of books in the Old Testament we call the former prophets, and most of us in the English-speaking world don't think of these as prophets. By these books we mean Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which in the Old Testament tradition are called the former prophets. We tend to call them historical books. But historical books is a little misleading. They are historical, but remember, the whole purpose of the wisdom tradition, or the prophetic tradition, is to interpret what God is doing in, with, and under history. And so these books are really providing a theological analysis of Israel's history, whose main focus is explaining why the exile took place. Keep in mind, in the ancient world, all around Israel, all the other nations worshiped many gods. Israel was distinctive in that Israel worshipped one God alone. Well, if you worship many gods, history is rather easy to explain. History is the working out of the conflict between the gods. So if the gods of these people over here on the left, want one thing, and the God for the people over here on the right, they want something else, and their gods are arguing with one another, fighting with one another, then the people fight with one another. And so, for example, you probably know the myth, legend, history, however you want to characterize it, of the Trojan War. And so, the gods, some of the gods favored the Trojans, some favored the Greeks, and as the gods struggled among themselves, the people groups struggled, and ultimately the gods who favored the Greeks prevailed, and so the Greeks prevailed. So history is explained in the ancient Near Eastern context in terms of the working out of the conflict between the gods. Well, that doesn't work for Israel. Right? Israel believes there's only one God, and if there's only one God, then you can't explain history as the working out of the conflict of the wills of the various gods. So how do you account, and the Old Testament message says that God loves Israel and called them to be his people and protects them and cares for them. If that's the case, how do you explain the fact that they went into exile? And not because Marduk, the god of Babylon, was more powerful than the God of Israel, because Marduk doesn't even exist. Now, there must be some other explanation. And the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings provide that theological explanation of how Israel went into exile, how and why Israel went into exile. So it's not just history, it's prophetic history. History that explains what God is doing in, with, and under the events of the time. By the way, the answer, of course, is spelled out clearly in these books, that God sent them into exile as a judgment on the fact that they disobeyed, not just once, but in an ongoing way, the instructions that God gave them for how to live as the people of God. So the former prophets and latter prophets, those are the two main books, two main sections of the Old Testament we think of as part of the prophetic tradition. But I'd like to suggest there's another part of the prophetic tradition, not part of the prophets as literature, and that's the part of the Old Testament we think of as the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Well, why would I say these are part of the prophetic tradition? We don't think of them as prophetic books. But when you think of the prophetic tradition in terms of interpreting what God's doing in history, then that's exactly what Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are doing. They're laying the foundation by explaining Israel's early history and what God was doing as he called them to be a people, as he gave them his teaching. He brought them out of slavery in Egypt, brought them to the land that he had promised to give to their ancestors, and establish them in that land. And so, interestingly, and surprisingly to many people, the Old Testament actually refers to Moses as the greatest prophet. I suspect if we went into any of your congregations on Sunday morning and said, let's take a poll, who is the greatest prophet in the Old Testament, I'm guessing probably Isaiah would come out on top of the poll for most congregations. Most Lutheran congregations, most Baptist congregations, most Catholic congregations, most congregations of any type, Isaiah would probably come out on top as the most important prophet. And maybe Jeremiah would get a few votes, and after that we have a little trouble because we're not sure who the others are. but at least Isaiah would certainly come out on top. But in fact, the Old Testament says that there never arose a prophet in Israel like Moses from that time onward. And not that, but God said to Moses that that in days to come he would raise up for Israel a prophet like Moses from among their brothers, and put his words in their mouths the way he had put his words in Moses' mouth. So all the other prophets in the Old Testament are shadows, remakes, if you will, modern movie term, of Moses' ministry. Moses was the first prophet because he's the one through whom God laid the foundation of interpreting what God was doing in Israel's history. So the Old Testament views Moses as the greatest prophet. And from the perspective of the New Testament, Jesus is ultimately the greatest prophet, because in him the work of God in history comes to its fulfillment. So the prophetic ministry of Christ, in terms of interpreting what God's doing in the history of the world, it makes Christ the ultimately greatest prophet. So I'd like to make that case for thinking of the Pentateuch, at least in prophetic terms. Within the Pentateuch, the books Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I've highlighted Exodus here and picked it out today as the one that we're going to focus on, because Exodus is the literary and theological center of the first book of the Bible. I was waiting for someone to protest that. Let's see how awake people are on Saturday morning here. The key phrase here is first book of the Bible. Right? Most people say, wait a second, I know that you're like an Old Testament professor and you've got a PhD from some fancy European university, but isn't Genesis the first book of the Bible? Well, yes and no. Okay. When we talk about books of the Bible, we're already being a little anachronistic, because there were no books at all in the Old Testament. Right? Books weren't. When was the book invented? Just a little bit of secular history. Anybody know?
Middle Ages.
Middle Ages, or the early Middle Ages, perhaps. Yeah, but probably the book form, that is, individual sheets, sewn together in a binding so that you can open it up. That's a relatively late invention in the history of the world, and probably something that was invented by Christians. Interestingly enough, there's some evidence in Turkey of using wooden tablets that were kind of tied together by leather, but it's not entirely sure whether that was a very widespread practice. But in any case, so far as we know today, archaeologically, in terms of cultural history, Christians were the first people to come up with the idea of a book, that is, individual sheets where you could just open it up at any point. Before that, there were no books per se. There were scrolls. And in this case, the Old Testament books were not written as books. They were written as scrolls. And this is important because the way scrolls are built, if you've got a big book like Genesis or Isaiah, you need a lot of scroll to include it. And they don't make cows that big, because you could take a strip off all the way around. And so the way scrolls are made, you take leather sheets, and sew them together so that you have a continuous whole. You see the picture. You can probably see the join of the two leather sheets here, where they're sewn together to make a scroll. But the issue is size. Here's a case where size matters a lot. If we're talking about the book of Isaiah, that first scroll that I showed you was the very famous scroll of the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Technically 1Q Isaiah A, for those of you who are detail-oriented and want to know such things. Well, the book of Isaiah is 1,291 verses. If you unroll the great Isaiah scroll, if we were to lay it out in this room, it'd probably fit. It would be about 65 feet long. So if you go in Jerusalem, as I've done many times, to the Shrine of the Book, part of the Israel Museum, where they've got the Dead Sea Scroll, where they keep the Dead Sea Scrolls. They've got 1Q Isaiah A rolled out on this big display, and you walk around it. It's about 65 feet around. It's not actually, by the way, the original. They built the museum and the display. They were going to put the original in it, and they did for a few years, and they discovered it was cracking because the scroll was made to roll up this way, but to put it in the museum, they had to wrap it around, so they bent it backwards, and because of its age and so forth, it was starting to break apart. So they quickly took it down, and they made a very, very, very careful replica of it. And if you go there today, what you see is the replica, not the original. They don't actually tell you that, but it is true. There are some parts of the original on display in little cases around, but most people don't bother even seeing them because they're so impressed with the big display. That's what they go to realize they're walking past the real thing to look at the imitation. There ought to be a sermon.
Very close to modern.
Well, there ought to be a sermon illustration in there somewhere, And but anyway, size matters. Isaiah, 1,291 verses. The scroll is 65 feet long. Now, if you took the whole Pentateuch, that is the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, were originally written as one book. And if you took that and put it on a scroll like 1 through Isaiah A, it would be, it's 5,853 verses. Anybody good enough at math, you can figure out how long it would be real quick?
Wow.
No, not quite a mile. But it would be roughly the length of a football field, 295 feet, more or less, given a few, plus or minus a few feet. So that would be a little bit clumsy if you had to unroll it to read it in church. If you got to scroll through and find something in the book of Deuteronomy, you would need like a dozen or so elders to help you unroll it, and it would be a little clumsy to use. So they divided, all the long books in the Bible get divided up. So we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 2 books, really one, but divided into 2 scrolls because of its length. 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And for the Pentateuch, which was originally one literary work, it got divided into 5 scrolls. And the 5 scrolls, we could call them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Moses, but they actually were named according to the first, at least initially, and in the Hebrew tradition, according to the first word in the book, the first word on the scroll, the first line. So they eventually comes to us as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Yes, ma'am?
So I want to know, just because maybe it'll take you out of your comfort zone, but why are the New Testament books like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John broken down? Because those obviously are long books.
Yeah, no, that's because they were separate letters written at different times. These were, it's really a matter of how things were ultimately collected together. The scrolls were kept, ultimately in the temple, later in the synagogues for reading in public services, and you just can't unroll them, so the long ones were subdivided. In the case of 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, length doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just that John wrote multiple letters, Peter wrote multiple letters, Paul wrote more than one letter to Corinth, and so forth. So the numbering there is for a different reason than the numbering of like 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are one continuous work.
Try to make them write on both sides of the scrolls to save cattle lives?
No, scrolls are only written on one side, and which is another reason that they're so long. And one of the other advantages to the book form is that you can write on both sides of the page. Now, you can't really write on both sides of a scroll because as you handle it, you would smear all the ink as you unrolled it from one side. You wrote on one side only. Now, when they wrote on clay tablets, they would write on both sides of the clay tablet. In Israel, they didn't really use clay tablets very much. What they used there was broken pottery. When I said we found the oldest Hebrew inscription ever found, is written on a piece of recycled pottery. Because they were, in the ancient world, they were the original recyclers. We think we've invented this idea of recycling. But in the ancient world, they recycled everything because they didn't have much to use. So clay pots were the plastic of the ancient world. Everything was made out of clay, pretty much, because there's kind of dirt in most places. You can make things in pottery out of clay and let it dry. But when it would break, as it would inevitably do, if they could, they would actually sew it together. So we have clay pots from Old Testament times, New Testament times too, where it was broken and they used leather, you get little holes in it, they used leather tongs to tie the broken pot back together. They didn't have super glue. And of course you couldn't keep liquid in it then, but you could still keep some solid things in it. But if it was broken in such a way that that wasn't feasible, then they would use it for other things. They would take, for example, they would take a piece of broken pottery and use it like you would use a Post-it note. Write a little note on it. Maybe a receipt. If I'm selling you something and you want a record for purposes, I pick up a piece of broken pottery and I say, 1 cow sold to Bob for 6 shekels. And, I'm going to give it to you or put it in my records. So a lot of things we find in the ancient world are written on broken pieces of pottery. We have a technical name for them, of course, but we don't, because helps academics keep their jobs if we have terms that nobody else can understand. It's sort of job security. And so when they wrote on clay tablets, or they wrote on pottery, they would often write on both sides, but not on scrolls. Question over here, then we'll take a break.
What did they, I know they, what did they write with?
Oh, what did they write with? Depends on what they were writing on. For example, if they were writing on clay tablets, they would use basically a stick with a pointy end, sort of like a pencil without lead in it. And usually the stick had a pointy end on one end and kind of a triangular end on the other, and they would poke the triangular end and then draw a line, the kind of writing that we sometimes call cuneiform. I actually should have brought along, I didn't know we were going to talk about this, I have samples of all these things, I mean actual physical samples I could have brought along and passed out, but
What was
pardon?
that was the instrument they wrote with.
Yeah.
They had to have, did they scratch it into?
No, they wrote on tablets, they would write when the clay was soft, you know, as you make a mud tablet, you know, and you write in it when it was soft, then they would set out in the sun to dry. They didn't bake them in the oven. These were kind of like read-writable CD-ROMs. All right, you would take the tablet and you would put it out, you'd dry in the sun, but if you didn't need it anymore, you could reuse it, you just dump it in the water and it would disintegrate and you could make another tablet out of it. So you could rewrite it. The ones that we find most often today we find them because the city was destroyed. Typically the city was burned, and when the city is burned, what happens to all those clay tablets? They get baked hard. You know, and so they become now not read-writable CD-ROMs, but just CD-ROMs. They're permanently written. So most of the ones we find today, we find because they were in some context that was burned, and they become hard, and therefore they haven't disintegrated over the years. And then
the scrolls, what did they write?
Yeah, the scroll itself would either be made out of a thin kind of leather, or out of in some cases out of a paper kind of substance we call papyrus, made from plant leaves. And either case it would be sewn together. Leather is the more durable material, it's also more expensive, obviously. And they would write on it with a kind of ink that's basically made from like olive oil and charcoal and they could use a few other pigments. They would sometimes have different colored ink, especially later on, not so much in early times, but by the time you get to Christ, they would sometimes write with a red ink or red paint. It's really more like paint. It's basically olive oil or oil based with charcoal ground up in it, or some other pigment agent, usually from a plant substance. The red, unfortunately, tends to fade, and so often, you know, where they wrote red, you can't be read by, it certainly can't be seen by the eye. You can bring it out chemically a little bit, but that's what they wrote on or with. So it depends on the substance. And by the way, we tend not to have scrolls. We're getting a little bit onto Chloe's subject here, or he would have talked about. Most of the people ask sometimes, well, why don't we have any older things? The oldest thing, everybody knows about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And we know about them. They're the oldest collection of biblical and non-biblical writings from Israel. And they date to about 150 BC to about 150 AD. And the reason they survived was because they were put in jars, sealed up, and put in caves. So they weren't exposed to the elements. See, scrolls and things like that tend not to survive because they're exposed to the elements. They're kind of cheap paper or leather, and they disintegrate. So the things that survive tend to be things that were written on monuments, like carved into stone, or these tablets that become baked hard because the city was burned down, or clay or this kind of pottery because pottery is still pretty durable, you know, so if it gets put someplace or covered up, it might survive. Or in Egypt particularly, we have written documents on paper/papyrus or leather because they were used as grave goods. And one of the reasons we don't have early copies of anything from the Bible is because the Israelites never used the Bible as something that they would bury with people in graves. You know, whereas in Egypt they put religious texts in graves when they bury people. And so they have survived because they were put in, to a coffin and put into the ground or buried some other way. And the climate is dry and hot enough that they didn't disintegrate. And so they survived. So from Egypt, we have a lot of materials that were found in graves, a lot of texts found in graves that we don't have from the biblical world, because in Israel, they simply didn't use the Bible they didn't bury Bibles with people or biblical books with people. And so the things that they used, for text, mostly leather or paper, they don't survive because they're exposed to the elements. So that's one reason we have so few really old copies. And we have written documents from other places, from Mesopotamia, from about 3,200 BC on, or from Egypt from about 3,000 BC on. We have very little old written material from Israel, and it simply has to do with what they wrote on and what they did with what they wrote. So it's kind of an accident of history. It's not that they didn't write or not that they didn't have copies, although they probably had fewer copies of the Bible. The Bible was really only kept in the temple, and a few people, wealthy people in particular may have had a copy, but the average person wouldn't have owned a copy of a biblical book. Simply too expensive to produce, and they would have heard it read, in the temple or in the synagogue later on. So there weren't as many copies, and the things they were written on were fragile and didn't survive.